and I'm fed up. My savings is earning no interest. And I can't earn a reasonable rate of return anywhere without taking crazy risks thanks to central bank policy. That's exactly what's happening right now. If you buy stocks, you're buying at their all-time highs. And we covered this actually. I wanted to expound on this a little bit further. Notes from the field. You're looking at a rate of return of 0.14%. 0.14%. That's less than 1%. That's practically 0%. I mean, this is what would have happened if you had bought stocks at one of their all-time highs, going all the way back to I believe this was with the 2000 high. 0.1%, 0.14%. This is if you had bought stocks that are all-time high and waited it out through years of rising interest rates, falling interest rates, crises, 9/11, the housing boom, the housing bust, the Lehman Brothers bust, the $1 trillion bailout that ensued, the swoons in the marketplace, the ups and the downs, and all the panic and chaos. When you adjust that stock return for taxes and inflation, you're walking away with 0.14%. Is it really worth it? Is it really worth all of that anxiety for 0.14%? I would say no. I think a rational person has got to say no, particularly when you look at what's happening out in the marketplace and you say, hey, wait a minute, there's high-frequency traders and the investment banks and the exchanges themselves, and everybody's there to sell me out and front-run me and make sure that I get screwed, and the big funds and the investment banks and all those guys make out well. And I think I said this yesterday. I'd really encourage everybody to read Michael Lewis's book, Flash Boys. That even an entire book just scratches the surface on really what's happening out there in the marketplace. And it doesn't even get into some of the other things, the manipulation that we've seen not only in stocks, but obviously in precious metals. And this isn't even conspiracy theory stuff. The banks aren't there for your benefit. The funds aren't there looking out for you. None of this is for your benefit. Nobody cares about the individual investor. We are there to be their feed. They are feeding off of us. They're sharpening their knives and forks, and they're there to take our money, and they only let us participate because they can profit from us. And if that system that's built for their benefit goes haywire, then they're going to go back in time, and they're going to take our money, and they're going to give it right back to these principles. That's the nature of investing in the stock market. You're buying in at all-time highs when every one of these entities is working against you, and even if you do it and you stick it out over the long term, because of course everybody says buy and hold for the long term, and none of that stuff matters, what are you going to get? 0.14%. That's your big prize. And it really makes a rational person say, is this all there is to invest in? Is this my only option, really, 0.14%, and taking this huge amount of risk and getting completely hosed by all the major participants? Is that my only investment option? No, of course not. You could also buy bonds, which is an even worse investment, because when you buy bonds, you're loaning your hard-earned savings to a bankrupt government. And if you're lucky, these days, a really lucky bond trade these days, you're going to actually get a positive rate of interest. You might actually get a positive rate of interest. Of course, it's not going to keep up with inflation. You might get 1%. Of course, the government's guerrilla math even says that inflation is 2%. Of course, anybody that's been to a grocery store, paid a medical insurance premium, gone to university, or just about anything else out there, actually in the real economy, knows that inflation is much more than 2%. If you're not so lucky, you're one of the suckers that's out there actually paying the government for the privilege of loaning them money. This is what, there's so many of these governments in Europe right now. If you want to buy short-term German debt, you have to pay them. This is the case that's so prevalent all over Europe right now. It is absolutely insane because most of these governments are insolvent. This isn't any sensationalistic, Simon's pulling some credit. No, this is their own numbers, their own financial statements. In the U.S., you can look at the Government Accountability Office. They publish financial statements of the United States government every year. The last one they did said negative $16.9 trillion. I have to imagine when they publish the latest ones, it's going to be far worse than that. Of course, the U.S. just hit $18 trillion in debt the other day. And Europe isn't, Europe is really in a worse situation. Japan, of course, is the worst of all. It's in the whole world now. I mean, the Western hierarchy is just a bunch of drunken sailors holding each other up and forcing the rest of the world to buy their bonds and even in certain cases pay negative interest. That's the other big investment opportunity. So you can buy stocks and get 0.14% and take these huge amounts of risk, or you can buy bonds and in many cases even take bigger risk and get and actually have to pay them for the privilege of doing it. I mean, what's the point? You would be better off just lighting some money on fire than loaning it to a government like this where you have to pay them interest. I mean, and it's a better story. Let's be honest. It's a better story. A bunch of fund managers sitting around and they, buy all these guys. And one guy comes in and he says, "Hey, what did you guys do? I lit my money on fire. At least that's cool. At least that's cool. What did you guys do? Oh, you bought bonds and paid the German government money. I mean, what's the point? What's the point? And you look at these options and you say, I could buy stocks and get nothing. I could buy bonds and actually have to pay them money. What if I do absolutely nothing at all? Oh, well, you hold your money in the bank. Then you come to find out that your bank is actually very poorly capitalized. Your bank is actually highly illiquid. Again, Germany, where you got banks that are charging their customers. Your customer wants to make a deposit and the bank says, okay, your interest rate is negative 0.5%. And I think that's indicative of what's happening really out there in the world. What happened in Hong Kong? They made a big stink. A bunch of protesters went out. They went out in the streets. They got a ton of media coverage. And then what happened? The media got sick of covering it. It wasn't on the front page story anymore. It sort of went to, page 4 of Google News. Nobody really cared anymore. The media stopped covering it. And the governments in general looked at this and they realized something very valuable here. What they learned is they said, you know what? If we can just hold out long enough, we're far more patient than people are. People eventually lose interest. They'll eventually pack up and go home. They'll pick up stakes, they'll fold up their tents, and they'll go back home and go back to the life that we dictate. Governments are a lot more patient. I think this situation in Hong Kong where the protesters just went home, I think this was a very important lesson for all governments. They realize we can wait longer than you. As that old Chinese adage, they say, if you sit by the river long enough, you'll see the body of your enemy floating by. That's us. We're the enemy. And they think that they can wait us out. They think that they can sit there long enough and, if they just refuse to cave, that eventually the protesters will go home. And that's why that stuff doesn't work. Freedom isn't necessarily earned by standing out in the streets and chanting and holding signs. And as much as I respect that, it's so noble and peaceful, and what a tremendously great ideal it is to say, I'm going to go out and I'm going to stand up for my freedom. It doesn't work. Voting doesn't work. Going to the voting booth and saying, I'm going to vote all the bums out. Guess what? You just get a whole bunch of new bums. The best vote that you can cast, the best action you can take is the one that you do with your feet, is by leaving, is the one that you do with your currency, with your cash, with your savings. So you know what? I'm divorcing myself from this banking system. I'm moving my money overseas. I'm reducing the amount of money that I pay to this bankrupt, corrupt government. I'm no longer supporting you. I'm no longer letting you afford to buy bombs and drones and more police and more guns and more all these things that they need to keep themselves in power and everybody else at bay. I'm not doing that anymore. I believe that people have a moral responsibility to do this.